The chairman of the African Presidential Leadership Center in Johannesburg, Ambassador Charles Stith, has written an opinion piece in the online version of the City Press newspaper. In it, he argues the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed some faults in various systems. Ambassador Stith is also a former American ambassador to Tanzania. He joins us now via Skype to tell us more about what he thinks of South Africa's current lockdown regulations. Ambassador Stith, a very good morning to you. Thank you for joining us. Unpack your thoughts in this regard in terms of regulations on smoking in South Africa during the lockdown period.
Sure. The first thing that I'd say is that I think President Ramaphosa and his team have done a good job of the lockdown. What I'd add, though, which is typical in any case like this, that every idea that's presented, some ideas sound better in theory than they are in terms of practicality. And as we've seen on the transportation ban with relaxing the capacity requirements, the government rightly acknowledged that some adjustments need to be made. I think the same could be said relative to smoking and the alcohol ban. I mean, neither are directly related to helping enforce the lockdown. Both clearly increase the aggravation of folks. And according to some recent studies, the ban is resulting in some fairly significant drops in terms of revenues and levy. I think for cigarettes, the number is somewhere around 35 million rand per day. For alcohol, it's 100 million rand per day. Given the impact of the lockdown on the economy, these are very important revenue streams that the government needs to be able to tap in order to mitigate the effects of the lockdown and stimulate the economy going forward.
In your article, you say that South Africa's regulations governing public transport was flawed right from the beginning. Why do you say that?
Well, you know, it's fairly clear, even to a casual observer, that there are a lot of people in South Africa that that depend on forms of public transportation, particularly the minibuses. And so when you have that capacity, there's going to be an impact, as was reflected in many of the stories that were done, including some by your network, that even essential workers were having problems getting to their employment destinations on time, if at all. And I thought it was smart of the government to reassess that policy and make necessary adjustments in order to enable people to get to where they needed to go.
How then should government enforce the lockdown regulations?
Well, I think the first thing that has to be appreciated is that the government is in uncharted territory. And as a result of that, it's going to find that some things work, some things don't work, some strategies work better than other strategies. And the sign of good leadership is when you see something that's not working, you don't double down. You look for an alternative to achieve the same end. As I said, I think at this point, President Ramaphosa has done an admirable job. And I think South Africans generally have been supportive of the leadership that he's provided. And what you want to do is to make sure that holds. I mean, one of the other points that I made in the op-ed piece was that for folks who are of means, who drink or who smoke, they haven't stopped drinking or smoking during the lockdown. I mean, they just bought enough alcohol and enough cigarette to last for the 21 days. Anybody who was out right before the lockdown could certainly see that folks were making provisions to cover themselves in terms of those kind of needs.
Ambassador, just before we move on to other issues, just want to say for anybody who's watched you on television, on your social commentary, we would know that you usually comment on global and particularly continental leadership in terms of the machinations of our leaders across the continent. Why have you decided to move on to this kind of conversation under the COVID-19 outbreak situation?
Well, first of all, the COVID-19 thing is all about leadership. Unfortunately, from the perspective of a U.S. Citizen, our guy in the White House has not done anywhere close to an admirable or creditable job in terms of providing leadership in the face of this sort of crisis. As I said earlier, given the hand that he's been dealt, I think President Ramaphosa has played that hand as well as can be expected. The fact that South Africans across the board are cooperating with the lockdown reflects they have confidence in his leadership. So a crisis like this is always about leadership. While COVID-19 is clearly a public health crisis, it's also an exercise in crisis management. So leadership, again, is important. Given the impact that COVID-19 has had on the global economy, given the impact that it's had on African economies, it's one of the sorts of things that we naturally gravitate toward in terms of commentary.
So President Cyril Ramaphosa in this instance is not only acting as the South African president, but also as the chair of the African Union. Now, Dr. Tedros of the World Health Organization says he's facing racial attacks and calls for him to step down. And President Ramaphosa has come up as one of the continental and also global leaders who've come out in support of the World Health Organization director. Your thoughts about this narrative?
Well, first of all, as my grandmama used to say, when you point one finger at somebody else, there are three pointed back at you. And given the crisis management disaster that the COVID-19 response has been globally, I'm not talking about South Africa, but globally, it's been a disaster. So there's enough blame to go around relative to how this thing might have been handled differently. Having said that, the last thing that leaders or citizens need to be doing is sniping at each other at this point. Cooperation and coordination are going to be key elements of the strategy, not only to further contain the viral outbreak, but more importantly, to kickstart the global economy and put people back to work.
Ambassador, what's the way forward? How do you see this unfolding, this tussle about competency and possible links to China? How will this all unfold?
Well, there's several things. The first of which is, again, I think President Ramaphosa needs to continue down the path of providing confident and careful leadership. I think that's absolutely important. The other thing that needs to be a serious consideration, a very serious consideration, is that viruses nor economic contagion know borders. And so it's going to be absolutely critical that South Africa works with others in order to dig itself out of the hole that it's in. You mentioned that President Ramaphosa is chair of the AU. He needs to convene the AU. He needs to convene SADC leadership in order to craft a response going forward in terms of how the global economy is going to rebound. South Africa is also a part of the World Health Organization solidarity clinical trials project. Those sorts of leadership initiatives need to continue to be pursued. But most importantly, African leadership stepped up to play their part to help stem the tide in terms of the spread of this virus. And they shouldn't feel like they have to bear the burden alone to rebound from that cooperative stand. Uh, in addition to the meetings with the AU and SADC leadership, South Africa is a member of the BRICS Alliance. That group needs to meet. And again, it's to make sure that moderate income countries, lower income countries don't have their interests shunted to the back. We can't have a top-down solution to solving the problems that are going to exist in the wake of this outbreak. And it's going to require cooperation, and we've got to make sure that trickle-down policies in terms of helping the world recover from this don't result in trickle-on realities for low and moderate income countries around the world.
What is your take on U.S. President Donald Trump threatening to withhold funding for the World Health Organization?
Well, I mean, as we've seen from the beginning, and it should come as no surprise that we were not going to get much in the way of constructive and creative leadership on the part of President Trump. It's unfortunate, but that's the unfortunate reality. I would be surprised if a threat like that actually resulted in action. There are clearly cooler heads in Congress, both on the U.S. Senate and House sides. The impetus for the stimulus package came from the Congress, and I think they'll continue to step up when necessary to ensure that the United States rebounds from this crisis, but that we also play our part globally to ensure that the rest of the world rebounds. And I'd add, quite frankly, that's in our self-interest. We do live in an era defined by global economics. It's impossible for us to maintain the same quality of life that we've come to know if we try to balkanize our responses to this crisis.
Well, Ambassador, because we're talking to you, we were tempted to go on to other issues, but we invited you on because of an article you wrote about the smoking and liquor and alcohol regulations during this lockdown period. But just to finally, just to finalize our conversation, the article about smoking, you're not concerned? Well, other organizations have come up to say that because of the restrictions, there is a concern about the growth of the illicit cigarette trade space. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, again, without making a judgment, about whether one ought to smoke or whether one ought to drink, the reality is that efforts at prohibition have never proved to be successful. We tried alcohol prohibition in the United States back in the 30s, and all it did was foster the creation of a criminal class. I mean, people want to smoke, people want to drink, they're going to do it. Quite frankly, this history has shown by whatever means necessary. And as it relates, as I said in the piece, to the lockdown, it really doesn't do anything to enforce compliance with the lockdown, and the key element of which is social distancing. mean, that's the point on which the government has declared it needs to focus. As such, that's the point on which it ought to focus. And given that 30% of the people in South Africa of drinking age drink, almost 18% of folks smoking age smoke, uh, why antagonize or isolate significant portions of the population that way? You want to keep everybody on the same page. And as I said, to date, I think the president has done a good job of that. I would just encourage him and his cabinet to continue to be sensitive so that where they need to tweak policies to keep people on board, that they need to do that.
Government must be sensitive in prescribing its laws. Thank you so much for talking to us this morning, Ambassador Charles Stith, the chairman of the African Presidential Leadership Center in Johannesburg. He's also the former U.S. ambassador to Tanzania.